Today, we're doing a deep dive into what you might call the engine room of the global supply chain. We're looking at some material from Adcorp, which is a huge workforce solutions organization, and we're going to be analyzing their new environmental, social, and governance, or ESG due diligence survey for their suppliers. This is not just about reading a mission statement. It's about how big companies turn these abstract ideas about ethics into, well, actual contractual requirements that affect everyone.
Exactly. And our mission for you, the listener, is to really understand the mechanics of this shift. Because ESG principles, they're not just aspirations anymore. They're not optional. We're going to look at how they become mandatory business requirements, the actual non-negotiable standards that decide who Adcorp will even partner with. And that, of course, means that compliance burden just flows right down the supply chain.
Okay, so let's set the stage with Adcorp itself. The material describes them as a major workforce solutions organization, right? They have huge operations in places like South Africa and Australia. Their whole business is built on creating these agile, skilled workforces. So when human capital is your actual product, your responsibility for ethical operations, for protecting human rights, it's just inherently magnified.
That magnification is absolutely the key word. Adcorp is dealing with some intense pressure. It's coming from regulators, sure, but mainly it's from their own big, high-profile clients. And these clients are demanding verifiable proof of standards around ethics, labor, the environment. Adcorp is sitting right in the middle of this web between the client and all their suppliers, so they have to operationalize it. This survey we're looking at, that's their main tool for managing that flow of risk.
So let's get into the specifics then. A lot of our listeners will know what ESG means in general, but Adcorp has some really tailored definitions here. They seem to reflect their specific business. So instead of textbook definitions, what are the practical implications here?
Exactly. When Adcorp talks ESG, what they're really doing is setting up metrics for accountability. Let's start with the E, for environmental. For a company like Adcorp, a service and staffing company, the big concern isn't heavy manufacturing waste.
Right, they're not running a factory.
No. So the focus is more on operational efficiency. How are they managing energy, water use, the life cycle of materials in their offices? But here's the critical part for a big company. The E now includes mandated Scope 3 emissions tracking, which means they have to understand the carbon footprint of their purchased goods and services, and that pulls the supplier directly into their environmental reporting.
Wow, okay. That immediately makes things way more complicated for the supplier. They might not have ever thought about their own Scope 3 footprint before. So that brings us to S, the social component, which I have to imagine is just enormous for a company focused on labor.
It's paramount. The social factor is all about people. Adcorp is stressing fair pay, safe work environments, protecting human rights, and the absolute prevention of any exploitation. And this is where geography really matters. Adcorp works in places like South Africa, which has incredibly specific, deeply rooted labor laws.
And Australia too, right, with the Modern Slavery Act.
Exactly. So the S part of the survey isn't some general checklist. It has to specifically address compliance within those very rigorous local legal frameworks.
That makes the S so dynamic. A supplier has to know not just global standards, but very specific regional laws. And that leaves us with G, governance.
Governance is the bedrock. It's how the company actually runs itself. This means strict compliance with all the anti-bribery laws, anti-corruption, preventing conflicts of interest, all of it. Because without solid governance, any claims about ENS are basically meaningless. The ethical infrastructure just isn't there to support them.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit. The core insight here is that ESG isn't just some soft policy anymore. It's quickly becoming hard law. It's becoming the contractual bedrock. So if you're in Adcorp's network, your ethical compliance is now directly tied to your commercial viability.
Precisely. It's gone from a moral suggestion to a mechanism of, well, commercial gatekeeping. Now let's look at the survey itself. It's easy to be cynical about these things, to just dismiss them as box ticking. But Adcorp lays out 4 specific goals here that suggest something more strategic is going on. They say they want to strengthen partnerships, get an honest read on current practices, spot risks early, especially labor risks, and then, of course, meet those client and regulatory demands.
I want to zoom in on that honest understanding part, because that feels like where this whole thing could fall apart. If the goal is continuous improvement, not just, disqualifying suppliers, why use a formal compliance survey? Doesn't that just incentivize people to hide their problems?
That is a very relevant challenge to their approach. And they seem to know it. They try to mitigate this by stressing a really crucial nuance. They say, company size and context matter. What that means is they're not going to treat a small local service provider in South Africa the same way they treat a massive multinational logistics firm.
So how does that actually work in the assessment, I mean?
Yeah.
What's the practical difference in expectation between a small business and a huge one?
Well, for a large, what they'd call a high-risk company, Adcorp is looking for what they term Level 2 implementation evidence. They're expecting formal policies, dedicated ones, independent audit reports, detailed risk registers, established frameworks for things like anti-corruption and modern slavery.
Okay, the whole 9 yards.
The whole 9 yards. But for a smaller company, they might only be looking for level 1 disclosure. They just want to see an awareness of the issues, maybe some basic documentation, evidence that the company is taking reasonable steps to manage simple risks. Things like using a standard employment contract that follows local minimum wage laws. They get that a small firm won't have a dedicated ESG committee.
That makes a lot of sense. It's about proportionality. And they make a big deal about honesty, saying this is a sense check, not an audit.
Oh.
So what happens if a small supplier is honest and says, look, we don't have a formal whistleblowing policy yet. What's next?
Transparency is the key. If you disclose a gap, as long as it's not some serious violation of human rights or the law, Adcorp can then offer resources, or maybe they'll suggest timelines for improvement. The sense check is really about generating data, profiling risk, and seeing where the network needs some support.
But what if it is serious?
Well, if the issue is serious, like, say, deliberate underpayment or major safety violations, that would be an immediate red flag. But the real deal breaker is dishonesty. If you lie on the survey and then a serious issue gets uncovered later, that breach of integrity is often grounds for termination. It doesn't even matter how big the initial offense was, the governance factor kicks in. You've destroyed the trust that the partnership relies on.
Okay, let's pivot to what seems like the most urgent area here, especially for a workforce solutions provider: modern slavery. Here's where it gets really interesting. This is where Adcorp, their clients, the regulators, everyone is laser focused.
The focus is absolutely intense, and that's because of the high risk that comes with complex global labor supply chains and Adcorp's direct role in placing and managing workers. They define modern slavery very clearly. It's an umbrella term. It covers serious abuses where people are exploited, and this is crucial. They can't freely leave their work because of threats or coercion or deception.
And the source material points out this terrifying fact: the practice is intentionally hidden. So how can a self-reported survey possibly uncover practices that are, by their very definition, based on deception and concealment? That seems like a fundamental flaw.
That's the core tension, and it's a valid one. No survey can guarantee detection. What the due diligence survey really functions as is a procedural defense mechanism. Adcorp is establishing that it has taken reasonable steps to investigate. That legal standard reasonable steps is critical, especially under Australian law. By forcing suppliers to attest that they have policies and are looking for risks, Adcorp is pushing that burden of initial diligence down the chain. But they also demand that suppliers know the 8 commonly recognized forms of modern slavery. These really define the scope of legal risk around the world.
Okay, let's walk through these 8 forms. It's important to give some context to these terms.
Right. First, we have forced labor. This is the standard definition. Work done involuntarily under threat of some kind of punishment or penalty. It often involves holding on to someone's wages or ID documents.
Next on the list is debt bondage.
Yes. This is where debt is used as the control mechanism. A person pledges their labor against a debt. But the terms, insane interest rates, unfair deductions, they ensure the debt can never actually be repaid. It traps them.
Number 3 is human trafficking,
which is really about the method of acquisition. It's the act of recruiting, moving, or harboring people for the purpose of exploiting them.
4th is what we might think of as the traditional definition: slavery and servitude.
Right. This is the most complete form of domination, where a person is literally treated as property or totally compelled to obey someone else.
Then number 5 is child labor.
And this isn't just about hiring a minor. It refers to work that is explicitly hazardous or stops kids from going to school or is just mentally, physically, or morally damaging to their development.
6th is forced marriage. This is one that gets overlooked in a business context, but it's a recognized form of slavery. A person is married without their free consent, and that often leads to domestic or sexual servitude.
7th is very specific to certain historical contexts. It's called descent-based slavery. This is institutionalized, intergenerational slavery. Someone is considered a slave just because their ancestors were.
And finally, the 8th category: the worst forms of child labor.
This goes beyond that 5th definition. It specifically includes just horrific practices. Things like child prostitution, child pornography, or forcing children into illicit activities like drug production or even armed conflict.
Listing them out like that really drives home the depth of the risk here.
It does. And the supplier isn't expected to be a global human rights agency, but they are expected to take those reasonable steps we talked about. Train your managers, audit your own subcontractors, have grievance mechanisms that people can actually access. That's the expected due diligence.
And there's a final, absolute red line. Adcorp says they'll engage with partners to fix risks, but that engagement stops cold if the issue involves deliberate or ongoing exploitation. It's a total non-negotiable. If you hide it, or if you refuse to stop it once it's found, the commercial relationship is over immediately.
That clarity is just essential for them to manage their reputational risk and meet what their clients are demanding. If they were seen to tolerate ongoing exploitation, Adcorp would instantly violate the very social principles they claim to be upholding.
Which brings us to the final summary of what they expect from everyone. While they allow for differences in maturity, that level 1 versus level 2, there are 5 core expectations that apply to every single supplier, no matter what. These are basically the ticket to get into Adcorp's network.
Yes, they really boil down to an ethical minimum. Every supplier has to, 1, conduct business with absolute integrity. That's the governance foundation.
2, respect human rights fully, the minimum standard for the social part.
3, provide safe and fair working conditions. This is about dignity and just basic labor laws.
4, prevent bribery, corruption, and any unethical conduct, reinforcing that legal compliance under governance.
And 5, comply with all applicable laws and regulations in the markets where you operate.
So what does this all mean? It means Adcorp is building this integrated chain of accountability. Their clients demand these standards from them, so Adcorp turns around and demands them from their suppliers. This deep dive really shows that supply chain ethics is no longer a PR talking point. It's operational risk management.
That's it, exactly. And the value proposition is simple. Compliance helps build a supply chain that's more transparent, more resilient, and more responsible. It mitigates what could be an existential risk for everyone involved, and, it strengthens the partnership for the long term by making sure everyone is playing by the same ethical rules.
This has been an incredibly detailed look at how global compliance actually gets put into practice. Thank you for walking us through Adcorp's due diligence framework.
Of course. And as you, our listener, reflect on this material, maybe consider this final thought. We analyzed how Adcorp's own documents define modern slavery as a practice that is based on coercion and deception and is often hidden. This makes the challenge of actually finding it immense. So if big organizations have to move beyond just policy and self-reporting, how effective can these procedural efforts really be? And what new tools, maybe it's AI, geo-tracking, independent third-party monitors, what does the next generation of due diligence need to adopt to go from just measuring the potential for risk to actively detecting hidden crime? That's really the question that remains for the entire global supply chain.